In the opulent heart of late 19th century New Orleans, where gaslight flickered across intricate wrought iron balconies and the humid air was thick with the scent of magnolias and decay, a dark legend was whispered to frighten children into obedience. They called it the tale of the butcher of the Vieux Carré, a boogeyman who stalked the narrow alleys and spirited away the unwary. It was dismissed by adults as a grim fantasy, a piece of local folklore born from the city's Gothic imagination. But like the most enduring legends, this one was rooted in a truth far more hideous than any fiction could conjure. The story we are about to uncover is not one of ghosts, but of a monster made of flesh and blood, whose evil was a celebrated delicacy served on the finest china in the city. To understand it, we must strip away the myth and examine the cold, documented facts of a case that poisoned the soul of New Orleans. Our investigation begins at the epicenter of this narrative, a shop on Chartres Street named Beaumont's Fine Meats. To the public of 1890, it was a paragon of cleanliness and quality. Polished brass hooks gleamed under the gas lamps, reflecting off immaculate white-tiled walls that were scrubbed daily. The air inside was an intoxicating symphony of aromas, the robust scent of hickory smoke, the sharp tang of cured meats, and an overwhelming, almost hypnotic blend of Creole spices, paprika, cayenne, allspice, and a dozen other secret ingredients. It was an establishment that projected an aura of unimpeachable respectability, a place where the city's elite felt safe, comfortable, and catered to. This pristine facade was the first and most critical component of the horror that unfolded within its walls, a carefully constructed stage for an unspeakable performance that ran for years without an audience. The crown jewel of Auguste Beaumont's business was his saucisse de spécialité, a spécialité andouillée sausage whose reputation was legendary throughout the French Quarter and beyond. Its flavor was described in almost reverent terms by the gourmands of the era. It was impossibly rich, subtly sweet, with a complex profile that no other butcher in the city could hope to replicate. Matriarchs of the oldest Creole families would send their staff to stand in line, refusing to host a society dinner without Beaumont's signature creation as the centerpiece. It was more than a food item. It was a status symbol, a testament to one's discerning palate. The secret to its unique taste was the subject of much speculation, but no one ever guessed the truth. They couldn't. The reality was so far beyond the pale of human decency that the mind instinctively recoiled from the very possibility. At the center of this world stood the proprietor himself, Monsieur Auguste Beaumont. He was the very picture of a respectable artisan, always impeccably dressed in a starched shirt and a pristine white apron that seemed to repel the very notion of a stain. He was a devout man, a regular presence at Sunday Mass, and a pillar of the local merchant community. He spoke with a soft, measured French accent, his manners as finely crafted as his cuts of meat. But for those with a discerning eye, a subtle dissonance lurked beneath the polished surface. His hands, though engaged in a bloody trade, were always unnaturally clean, scrubbed to a raw pinkness, and his eyes, while he smiled and served his wealthy clientele, held a chilling emptiness, a cold, calculating void that seemed to assess, rather than see, the people before him. The questions about his methods were always met with a disarming, almost paternalistic smile. Competitors, consumed by professional jealousy, would attempt to pry the secret of his spice blend from him, but Beaumont would simply chuckle and claim it was an ancestral recipe from his family in Lyon or France, a sacred trust he could not betray. This narrative of old-world tradition was readily accepted by a society that fetishized European heritage. His secrecy was not seen as suspicious, but as the charming eccentricity of a true master dedicated to his craft. This meticulously maintained illusion of normalcy was his most formidable weapon, a shield of respectability that rendered his actions invisible. He operated not in the shadows, but in the blinding light of public admiration, his greatest crime hidden behind the mundane rhythm of a successful business. While the city's elite savored Beaumont's creations, another, unseen population moved through the city's arteries like phantoms. The street children of New Orleans, the orphans, the runaways, the destitute, lived in a world entirely separate from the gaslit parlors and grand townhouses. They were a constant, yet ignored, feature of the urban landscape, their grimy faces and bare feet a minor inconvenience to be overlooked. Their disappearances were frequent and uninvestigated. The official logs, when they were recorded at all, would mark them as runaways, another soul lost to the river or the anonymity of the road. No one claimed them, no one searched for them, and so their absence created no void. To society, they were disposable. To Auguste Beaumont, they were something else entirely, the perfect, untraceable raw material for his celebrated art. The legend of the butcher is an echo that endures to this day, a chilling reminder of the darkness that can hide behind a veneer of civility. And since these stories travel through time, tell us in the comments what city you are joining us from for this investigation, and the exact time. With your presence marked, let us return to 1890 and discover how the first crack appeared in the butcher's immaculate facade, through the eyes of a man who refused to believe that some children were simply born to disappear. Far from the polished brass and fragrant spices of Chartres Street, in a damp and crumbling corner of the city, stood the St. Jude's orphanage. It was here, amidst the scent of boiled cabbage and wet stone, that Father Thomas began his work. Newly arrived from a Boston seminary in the spring of 1890, his mind was filled with modern ideals of social justice that were entirely alien to the languid, class-bound world of New Orleans. He saw the city not as a romantic tableau of Creole charm, but as a machine with broken teeth, grinding the poor and the forgotten into dust. His parish was small, his resources meager, and the faces of the children in his charge were a daily testament to the city's profound indifference. He was a man of quiet faith, but a fierce, simmering anger was beginning to take root in his soul, an anger directed at a society that could celebrate such opulence while allowing its children to starve in the shadows. Among the dozen or so children in his care, one boy stood out. His name was Leo, a quiet 10-year-old with eyes that seemed to hold the city's entire history of sorrow. He rarely spoke, but his hands were never still. From scraps of wood, he would whittle small, intricate birds, each one a minor masterpiece of childhood artistry. His most prized possession was a single, perfectly formed mockingbird that never left his pocket. It was his talisman, his only connection to a world before the orphanage. Leo was the embodiment of the children Father Thomas had sworn to protect, small, resilient, and utterly invisible to the grand society that bustled just a few streets away. He was a flicker of life in a world determined to extinguish such flames, a fact that made his sudden absence all the more deafening when the day came that he simply did not return for the evening meal. The disappearance was a quiet affair, a non-event in the city's daily ledger of human misery. On May 12, 1890, after Leo had been missing for 2 days, Father Thomas filed a report at the 3rd Precinct. He described the boy, the worn clothes, the nervous energy, and the small wooden bird he always carried. He tried to convey the gravity of the situation, the certainty in his gut that this was not a simple case of a boy wandering off. The desk sergeant, a man whose weary expression suggested he had seen 1,000 such priests with 1,000 such stories, listened with practiced patience. He took down the details in a slow, deliberate script, his pen scratching against the cheap paper, the sound echoing the priest's own growing sense of futility. The official process was a hollow ritual, a pantomime of concern in a city that had none. The resulting police record, which can still be found in the city archives, is a monument to bureaucratic apathy. File number 734B notes the disappearance of one Leo, no surname, age approximately 10. The report is barely 100 words long, concluding with the single dismissive phrase, "Presumed runaway, case closed." There was no investigation, no search party, no questions asked in the back alleys or flophouses. A child had been erased from the world, and the official record acted not as an alarm, but as a tombstone, marking a life that society had already deemed worthless. For Father Thomas, this casual dismissal was a profound moral injury. It was the moment he understood that the systems he was taught to trust were not merely flawed. They were complicit in the quiet extermination of the city's most vulnerable, a silent partner to some unseen evil. 2 weeks after Leo vanished, a strange and unsettling event occurred. Monsieur Auguste Beaumont, the celebrated butcher of the French Quarter, made a personal visit to St. Jude's. It was an unprecedented act of public charity. Dressed in his Sunday finest, Beaumont presented the parish with a donation of $100, an immense sum for the struggling orphanage. He spoke in soft, pious tones of his civic duty and his Christian compassion for the less fortunate. The older priests lauded his generosity, seeing it as a sign of God's providence. But Father Thomas, standing at the back of the room, felt a cold dread wash over him. He watched Beaumont's immaculate hands, the same hands that expertly wielded a cleaver, as they passed over the envelope. The butcher's benevolence felt rehearsed, his smile a mask concealing something cold and predatory just beneath the surface. The timing of the donation gnawed at the young priest. It felt like a transaction, a balancing of some hidden, unholy ledger. The money, meant to sustain life, felt like blood money, though he could not articulate why. He began to observe the butcher from a distance, noting his comings and goings, the rhythmic thud of his cleaver that could be heard from the street, a sound that now seemed less like craftsmanship and more like a metronome for some sinister purpose. This growing obsession was a quiet one, a secret he kept locked behind a facade of prayer and parish duties. He was beginning to see two versions of New Orleans, the sunlit city of commerce and faith, and a shadow city of whispers and disappearances. And he suspected, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that Auguste Beaumont was a citizen of both. His fears were cemented a month later when another child, a 7-year-old girl named Marie, who sold flowers near the market, also disappeared without a trace. The pattern was no longer a suspicion. It was a horrifying, emerging truth. 2 children, both from the periphery of society, both vanishing into thin air. Father Thomas knew in his heart that this was not the work of chance. A predator was moving through the city's underbelly, harvesting the forgotten. He began his own quiet investigation, walking the same grimy alleys the children had frequented, speaking to their friends, the other small ghosts who haunted the city. He was met with fear and silence. The children knew something was wrong. They spoke in hushed tones of a sweet smell that sometimes lingered near the butcher's shop late at night, a smell they found both enticing and terrifying. These nocturnal walks became a ritual for Father Thomas, a pilgrimage into the heart of the city's darkness. He learned the geography of the dispossessed, the hidden routes through courtyards and behind restaurants where the street children lived and died. He saw the stark contrast between the opulent storefronts and the festering decay just behind them. The air in these backways was thick with the stench of refuse and despair, but as he drew closer to the French Quarter, another scent would occasionally cut through the foulness. It was a rich, complex aroma of roasting meat and exotic spices, paprika, cayenne, and something else, something cloyingly sweet that clung to the humid air. It was a scent of comfort and domesticity, yet in these dark and deserted alleys, it felt profoundly, unnervingly out of place. He started a private log, a simple notebook where he recorded the names and dates of every missing child he could account for over the past year. The list grew with alarming speed. There was Leo, then Marie, then a boy named Samuel who shined shoes, and 2 sisters who sold matches. He cross-referenced his notes with the precinct's scant records, finding the same pattern of indifference and inaction each time. He felt like a man shouting a warning in a soundproof room. His faith, once a source of comfort, now felt like a powerless abstraction in the face of such tangible evil. He was no longer just a priest. He had become a chronicler of the lost way, a lone detective in a case that officially did not exist, driven by the conviction that he was tracking the shadow of a monster. Armed with his growing list of names, Father Thomas confronted his superior, Monseigneur Dubois, a man whose faith had long ago calcified into administrative routine. He laid out the timeline, the pattern of disappearances, the palpable fear among the street children. The Monsignor listened with a look of weary condescension, then gently rebuked the young priest for his morbid imagination. He attributed the disappearances to the natural attrition of poverty and cautioned Thomas against meddling in police matters. "Your duty is to the souls of the living, not to the ghosts of runaways," he advised. The words were a final, devastating confirmation of his isolation. The church would not help him. The law would not help him. As he walked out of the rectory, the weight of his knowledge settled upon him. He was utterly alone, the sole guardian of a truth too terrible for the city to comprehend. The humid air of late June hung over the French market like a shroud, thick with the competing smells of chicory coffee, wilting flowers, and the brackish water of the nearby Mississippi, Father Thomas moved through the throng of shoppers and vendors, his black cassock a stark slash of mourning against the vibrant chaos. He was searching for any trace of Marie, the little flower girl who had vanished 3 days prior. He clutched a faded daguerreotype of her, a solemn, wide-eyed ghost he showed to merchants who barely glanced up from their scales and coin boxes. Their responses were a chorus of shrugs and headshakes, the familiar symphony of indifference that greeted the disappearance of a child who had never truly existed in their world. The market, a place of life and commerce, had already swallowed her memory whole, digesting it with the same casual efficiency with which it processed the day's goods. His search felt less like an investigation and more like a desperate prayer whispered into a hurricane. Driven by a grim intuition, he abandoned the bustling market square and slipped into the labyrinthine alleys behind the grand storefronts. Here, the world changed instantly. The cheerful noise was replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence, broken only by the drip of unseen water and the scuttling of rats. The air, too, was different, a foul cocktail of rotting produce, stale beer from the taverns, and human waste. This was the city's digestive tract, the hidden space where the refuse of the opulent world he had just left was left to fester. He picked his way carefully over slick cobblestones and piles of refuse, his eyes scanning every dark corner, every pile of discarded crates. He was now in the territory of the lost children, a geography of shadows defined not by street names but by degrees of decay and despair. It was here, he knew, that answers were either found or buried forever. It was then that he saw it, a small, incongruous splash of color against the uniform gray-green slime coating the bars of a sewer grate. He stopped, his heart seizing in his chest. He knelt, the dampness of the stones seeping through the thin fabric of his trousers, and reached a trembling hand towards the object. It was a hair ribbon, made of a cheap, coarse fabric, its once bright blue faded by sun and stained by the filth of the alley. He recognized it instantly. Marie had worn it the last time he saw her, a pathetic attempt at finery tied into her matted hair. It was caught on a rusted iron bar, a fragile flag of surrender. For 3 days, Marie had been an abstraction, a name on a list. Now, holding this small, soiled piece of fabric, her absence became a tangible, physical wound. She had been here. As he knelt by the grate, a wave of noxious air rose from the depths of the city's underbelly, a smell so potent it made his eyes water. It was the familiar, foul breath of the sewer, a miasma of stagnant water and decomposition. But as he remained there, his senses reeling, he began to dissect the odor, isolating its components with the grim focus of a coroner. Beneath the expected stench, another, more alien scent asserted itself. It was a sharp, acrid smell, chemical and clean in the most unsettling way. It was the unmistakable odor of lye, a powerful caustic agent used for cleaning, for stripping flesh from bone. It was a smell of erasure, of a desperate, meticulous effort to wash away evidence, a scent that had no business being in the organic decay of a common sewer. Why would someone pour LIE into a drain with such industrial purpose? And then, a third layer of scent, the one that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life, emerged from the grate. It was faint, almost lost beneath the lye and the filth, but it was persistent. It was a warm, spicy, and cloyingly sweet aroma. It carried notes of paprika, of allspice, and the rich, smoky perfume of cured meat. It was a complex, almost appetizing fragrance, a scent that spoke of hearty meals and well-stocked kitchens, of culinary craft and Creole tradition. The juxtaposition was so profoundly wrong, so utterly nightmarish, that his mind struggled to process it. This delicious, comforting smell, rising from a place of absolute filth and connected to a missing child's last known location, was a violation of the natural order. It was the smell of a home-cooked meal rising from a fresh grave. The paradox was a key turning into a lock he had not known existed. His blood ran cold. The familiarity of the aroma struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had smelled this exact blend of spices before. It was the signature scent that clung to the clothes of the wealthy parishioners who frequented Beaumont's fine meats. It was the celebrated, intoxicating perfume of Auguste Beaumont's saucisse de spécialité, the legendary andouille sausage that was the toast of New Orleans society. The very aroma that signified wealth, taste, and respectability was seeping from the sewer in a forgotten alley, mingled with the chemical stench of a cover-up. The connection was immediate, undeniable, and so monstrous that it threatened to shatter his sanity. The secret ingredient was not a rare spice from a distant land. The secret was something far more elemental, far more profane. Suddenly, all the disparate, unsettling pieces of the puzzle slammed together in his mind, forming a picture of unimaginable horror. Beaumont's unprecedented donation to the orphanage, an act of charity that followed so closely on the heels of Leo's disappearance. The hushed, fearful whispers of the other street children, their stories of a sweet smell that drifted from the butcher's back door late at night, an aroma that both tempted and terrified them. The butcher's unnaturally clean hands and the cold Dao's appraising emptiness in his eyes. It was not a pattern of coincidence. It was the meticulous, horrifying methodology of a predator who had turned the city's most invisible citizens into a celebrated delicacy. The thought was so vile, so far beyond the bounds of human depravity, that he felt a wave of nausea rise in his throat. He remained kneeling on the wet stones, the tattered blue ribbon clutched in his white-knuckled fist, his mind a maelstrom of revulsion and terror. The sounds of the market just a block away, the laughter, the haggling, the music, seemed to come from another planet, a world of blissful ignorance he could never rejoin. He had stumbled across a truth that the city was not prepared to hear, a secret kept not in a locked vault, but hidden in plain sight, served on the finest china at the most exclusive dinner parties. He understood now that Beaumont's shop was not merely a business. It was a charnel house, a factory that processed human misery into a luxury good, and its proprietor was not a man, but a monster wearing the mask of civility. The full weight of his discovery pressed down on him, a burden of knowledge that felt heavier than any sin. He felt a profound, chilling isolation. He was the sole keeper of this hideous secret. The police, with their dismissive reports and weary apathy, would never believe him. Monsignor Dubois, with his preference for comfortable faith over inconvenient truths, would accuse him of madness. He looked from the ribbon in his hand to the solid brick wall of the butcher shop's rear facade. The rhythmic, muffled thud of a cleaver striking a wooden block could be heard from within, a steady, almost peaceful sound that now seemed like the heartbeat of some ancient, nameless evil. The sound was no longer that of a craftsman at his trade. It was the sound of methodical destruction, the percussion of a meticulous and ongoing atrocity. Each strike was another piece of a child being rendered into a product. Slowly, Father Thomas pushed himself to his feet, his body aching with a coldness that had nothing to do with the damp stones. The ribbon felt like a sacred relic in his palm, the last testament of a life that had been consumed. His grief had been burned away, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. His quiet investigation was over. The time for prayer and passive observation had passed. He was no longer just a priest searching for the lost sheep of his flock. He was now a hunter, and he knew the name of the wolf that was devouring them. As he walked out of the alley and back into the blinding sunlight, he carried the stench of the sewer with him, a scent that was no longer just decay, but the undeniable perfume of murder. Father Thomas returned to the labyrinth of alleys behind the French market, but he was a changed man. The grief that had crippled him by the sewer grate had now cooled into a focused, analytical resolve. He was no longer a shepherd searching for a lost lamb. He was an investigator mapping the hunting grounds of a wolf. He began to move through the shadow world of the street children not with pity, but with purpose. He sought them out in their hidden enclaves, beneath loading docks, in the husks of abandoned warehouses, and in the forgotten courtyards overgrown with creeping vines. He brought not sermons, but small offerings of bread and a quiet, patient presence, understanding that trust in this world was a currency more valuable than gold, and far harder to earn. His mission was to give a voice to the ghosts who could no longer speak for themselves, and he knew their living friends were the only ones who had seen the reapers at work. Initially, his questions were met with a wall of hardened silence. These children were a tribe, bound by a shared code of survival that taught them that adults, especially those in positions of authority, were a source of danger, not salvation. They looked at his clerical collar with suspicion, their eyes old with a weariness that belied their years. But Father Thomas did not press. He simply sat with them, sharing his meager food, asking about their lives, learning their names, and listening to their stories. He showed them the tattered blue ribbon, and in their shared glance of recognition and sorrow, a crack appeared in their defensive shell. They saw in his eyes not the detached pity of a charity worker, but the shared pain of a fellow mourner, and slowly, hesitantly, the whispers began, a chorus of fear that confirmed his darkest premonitions. The stories they told were fragmented, threaded with the superstitions and fears of childhood, but they all orbited a single, terrifying point of gravity: the butcher's back door. They spoke of a thick, sweet-smelling smoke that would pour from a chimney on the shop's rear wall, but only in the dead of night, long after the last gas lamps on Chartres Street had been extinguished. It was a delicious smell, they admitted, a rich, spicy aroma that made their empty stomachs ache with a desperate, gnawing hunger. Yet, it was also a smell that terrified them. They spoke of how it seemed to call to the most desperate among them, a fragrant siren song promising warmth and food. More than one child, they recounted, had been drawn towards that intoxicating smoke, mesmerized by the promise of a hot meal, only to vanish into the night, never to be seen again. The door itself became a character in their tales. It was a heavy, iron-strapped portal of thick cypress wood, always bolted from the inside, its surface stained with years of grime. To them, it was a gate to an unseen world. From behind it, at those same unnatural hours, they would hear noises, not the clean, rhythmic chopping of the daytime, but a deeper, more industrial sound. They described it as a heavy, mechanical grinding, a relentless churning that would go on for hours, accompanied by the hiss of steam and the clatter of metal on stone. It was the sound of a factory, they whispered, a place that took things in but never let them out. The sweet smoke and the grinding gears became the twin horrors of their nights, a sensory testament to a process they could not comprehend but knew, with primal certainty, was utterly evil. Armed with this chilling testimony, Father Thomas knew he needed more than the fearful whispers of children. He required irrefutable, tangible evidence, something that could be presented to the world of law and logic. He formulated a plan, a simple but dangerous ruse. He would approach Monsieur Beaumont under the guise of soliciting another generous donation for St. Jude's, a pretext that would appeal to the butcher's carefully curated public image as a pious philanthropist. The thought of facing the man, of breathing in the fragrant air of his shop while knowing its horrific secret, filled him with a profound dread. But the faces of Leo and Marie, and the ever-growing list of the lost, propelled him forward. He had to walk into the lion's den, not to fight the beast, but to steal the records of its kills. He entered Beaumont's fine meats the following afternoon. The contrast between the sun-drenched, bustling street and the cool, orderly interior was jarring. The air was thick with the familiar, intoxicating blend of smoked meats and Creole spices, an aroma that now turned to ash in his throat. Auguste Beaumont greeted him with his customary, disarming politeness, his white apron a beacon of impossible purity. As Father Thomas made his appeal for the orphanage, he allowed his gaze to drift around the shop, finally landing on the large, leather-bound ledger resting on a lectern near the counter. It was the business's heart, its official memory. With a feigned interest in the butcher's commercial success, the priest inquired about his bookkeeping, praising his meticulousness, and asking, with a carefully crafted innocence, if he might see how a master artisan chronicled his trade. Beaumont, his vanity stoked, was only too happy to oblige. He saw the priest's interest as a testament to his own stature, as a pillar of the community, a man whose success was worthy of study. For a few moments, he proudly explained his system, the columns for sales, the notations for inventory. Then, a wealthy client entered, and Beaumont was drawn away to discuss a special order for an upcoming soirée. It was the opening Father Thomas had prayed for. With his heart hammering against his ribs, he turned his full attention to the ledger. The paper was thick and expensive, the ink a deep, confident black. He ran his finger down the columns, the neat, precise script detailing the mundane transactions of a thriving business. For a terrifying moment, he found nothing, just an impenetrable wall of normalcy that threatened to make him doubt his own sanity. Then he saw it. The entry was dated May 10th, the day after Leo had vanished. It was not a record of a sale, but of a purchase. An order of spices from a specialty importer in the Vieux Carré, 3 pounds of Hungarian paprika, 2 of cayenne pepper, and a full pound of costly allspice. The quantity was commercially absurd for a shop of this size, an expenditure so extravagant it defied logic. He remembered the date of Marie's disappearance and flipped forward. There it was again, on June 18th, another identical order, another impossibly large purchase of the exact same 3 spices. A cold sweat broke out on his brow as he began to turn the pages more frantically, his memory of the missing children's names and dates guiding his search. Samuel Fu, the shoeshine boy, the 2 matchstick sisters. Each disappearance was marked in the ledger by this silent, aromatic tombstone. The pattern was undeniable, a horrifyingly consistent record of the butcher's monstrous production cycle. The children would vanish, and within 48 hours, Beaumont would restock the key ingredients for his saucisse de spécialité. But as Father Thomas stared at the page, his blood turning to ice, he noticed something else. A detail so small and so diabolical it felt like a personal message from the devil himself. Next to each of the anomalous spice purchases, tucked beside the final sum, was a tiny, almost imperceptible mark, etched into the paper with a finer pen. It was a symbol, a miniature, stylized drawing. He had to lean in close, his breath catching in his throat, to recognize the shape. It was a bird, a mockingbird, identical in its delicate form to the small wooden figures Leo used to whittle in the orphanage courtyard. It was a trophy, a signature. Beaumont was not just a killer, he was a collector, a connoisseur of his own depravity. And this ledger was not merely an account book. It was his private, coded diary of murder. Each tiny bird was a life he had consumed and monetized, a macabre tally mark in a game only he was playing. The full, calculated evil of the man was laid bare in that single, elegant symbol. He was not just disposing of the unwanted, he was commemorating his work, taking a perverse pride in transforming the city's most vulnerable souls into his celebrated masterpiece. The realization struck Father Thomas with the force of a physical blow, leaving him breathless and dizzy with a mixture of horror and revulsion. He had found his proof, but it was a truth so monstrous he feared no one would ever believe it. A soft cough broke his trance. He looked up to see Auguste Beaumont standing beside him, the butcher's polite smile fixed in place, but his eyes were like chips of cold slate. He had been watching. An interesting study in commerce, how is it not, Father? Beaumont's voice was as smooth and pleasant as ever, but it now carried a chilling undertone, a silken threat. The air in the shop, once intoxicating, now felt heavy and suffocating, thick with the unutterable secret they now shared. The illusion of the respectable artisan had vanished, replaced by the cold, appraising gaze of a predator who had just realized his hunting grounds had been discovered. The space between them crackled with a silent, terrifying understanding. The priest was no longer a solicitor of charity. He was a witness. Beaumont leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, the scent of allspice on his breath. A city like ours, Father, it has a delicate constitution. It cannot digest its own refuse. A successful man, a civic-minded man, must find creative ways to eliminate waste, to transform the unpleasant into the palatable. It is a form of alchemy, you see, a service, really. He spoke not with the frenzy of a madman, but with the calm, rational tone of a philosopher explaining a fundamental truth. He was not confessing to a crime. He was articulating a worldview, a hideous philosophy of social sanitation where he was the final, purifying agent. This calm, intellectual pride in his actions was somehow more terrifying than any display of rage would have been. With a theatrical flourish, Beaumont turned to the counter, took up a long, thick link of his prized andouille, and wrapped it neatly in white butcher paper. He turned back to the priest and pressed the heavy parcel into his hands. It was still warm. "A gift, Father," he said, his smile never wavering. "For the orphanage, a token of my continued Christian charity." The weight of the sausage in Father Thomas's hands felt obscene, a grotesque parody of the Eucharist. Beaumont's eyes locked onto his, and in their cold, empty depths, the priest saw a clear and unambiguous challenge. "You must try it. It is my finest work, made with only the most select ingredients. I insist." It was a threat, a sacrament of silence, and a declaration of his absolute confidence that no one would ever believe the word of a poor priest over that of a celebrated gentleman. Father Thomas stumbled out of the shop and into the blinding afternoon sun, the heavy parcel clutched in his trembling hands. The sounds of the French Quarter, the clatter of carriages, the call of vendors, the distant melody of a jazz clarinet, seemed to come from another world, a reality from which he was now permanently exiled. He walked in a daze, the butcher's parting words echoing in his mind. The confrontation had been a declaration of war. Beaumont had not only confirmed his guilt, but had reveled in it, confident in the shield of his reputation and the city's willful blindness. The priest now held the proof, both in his mind and in the sickening weight of the parcel he carried, but he was more isolated than ever. He was the sole keeper of a truth so vile it could poison the very soul of New Orleans. That night, sleep was an impossibility. The wrapped sausage sat on the small wooden table in his Spartan room at the rectory, a malevolent presence in the darkness. He could feel its heat, smell its spicy perfume seeping through the paper, an aroma that was now inextricably linked with the stench of death and lie. Every creak of the old building, every shadow that danced in the moonlight, seemed to be Beaumont's specter, mocking him. The weight of his knowledge was a physical burden, crushing his spirit. He felt the ghosts of the children around him, their silent screams demanding justice, a justice that seemed impossibly distant. He was one man against a monster who was not only protected by society, but celebrated and consumed by it. His faith offered no comfort, only the stark, terrifying question of how God could permit such an abomination to exist. He knew he could not confront this evil alone. The church had already failed him, and the police were a bastion of apathy. But his desperation forged a new kind of clarity. If the system was corrupt and indifferent, he would have to find a crack within it, a single gear that was not yet rusted into place. He spent the next day in the city archives, poring over public records and newspaper articles, searching not for a saint, but for a man whose ambition might be leveraged for the cause of justice. He dismissed the precinct captains and senior detectives, men whose careers were built on maintaining the status quo. He needed someone young, hungry, and perhaps even a little reckless, someone who saw the city's entrenched power structures not as something to be respected, but as something to be conquered. His search led him to a name, Captain Luc Renaud, a recent transfer from up north. Renaud was known within the department as an outsider, a man with a reputation for aggressive tactics and a palpable disdain for the slow, genteel corruption of New Orleans law enforcement. He was disliked by the old guard, but respected for his results. He was driven, not by a profound sense of morality, but by a burning desire for advancement, to make a name for himself in a city that viewed him with suspicion. Father Thomas knew this was a dangerous alliance. Renaud's ambition could be a powerful weapon, but it was a blade that could easily cut both ways. Yet, in a city of the willfully blind, a man who was ruthlessly ambitious to see might be his only hope. With a clear target in mind, Father Thomas began to assemble his case, meticulously preparing for the most important appeal of his life. He understood that he could not walk into Captain Renaud's office and speak of cannibalism and secret symbols. Such a story would get him dismissed as a lunatic. He needed a Trojan horse, a crime that was mundane enough to be believable, yet serious enough to warrant an investigation. He spent the night carefully transcribing the damning entries from Beaumont's ledger, focusing not on the missing children, but on the massive, unaccounted-for expenditures on spices. He would frame his accusation in the only language the system truly understood: money. His case would not be about murder. It would be a meticulously documented report of suspected tax evasion and financial fraud, a secular sin to expose a truly satanic evil. The meeting took place in Captain Luc Renaud's cramped office at the 3rd Precinct, a space that smelled of ink, damp wool, and the captain's own restless ambition. Father Thomas, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, did not speak of missing children or the scent of death. Instead, he presented his carefully constructed fiction, laying the transcribed pages from Beaumont's ledger upon the captain's cluttered desk. He pointed to the impossibly large and frequent purchases of spices, the lack of corresponding sales receipts, and the clear signs of a secondary, unrecorded income stream. He spoke the language of the secular world, of tax evasion, of smuggling, of financial fraud on a grand scale. He offered Renaud not a monster to be slain, but a white-collar criminal whose downfall would make for sensational headlines, a perfect target for a young captain eager to make his mark on the city. Renaud, a man whose cynicism was as sharp as the crease in his trousers, listened with a predatory stillness. He cared little for the soul of the city, but he understood its mechanics intimately. He knew that the old Creole families who ran New Orleans operated on a system of quiet corruption, and that a man like Beaumont, while publicly lauded, was just as likely to be skimming from his profits as any other merchant. The priest's evidence while circumstantial, was compelling enough to secure a warrant for financial inspection. The potential for a high-profile conviction was a lure Renaud could not resist. He saw the butcher not as an agent of evil, but as a rung on the ladder of his own career. He assured the priest that he would conduct a thorough search of the premises at dawn the next day, his tone suggesting he was humoring a citizen's concern while privately relishing the impending professional triumph. The raid on Beaumont's fine meats began just as the first pale light of dawn touched the wrought iron balconies of Chartres Street. Captain Renaud and a small, hand-picked team of officers entered the shop, their heavy boots echoing in the pristine silence. The scene that greeted them was one of almost fanatical order. The white tiles on the walls and floor gleamed, scrubbed to a brilliant shine. The brass hooks hanging from the ceiling were polished to a mirror finish, and the great wooden butcher block in the center of the room was so clean it looked as if it had never been used. The air itself was fragrant and pure, a carefully managed symphony of spices and smoked wood, with no hint of the foulness Father Thomas had described. For a moment, a flicker of doubt crossed Renaud's face. The place was less a butcher shop and more a temple to cleanliness. The initial search of the main shop and the small living quarters above yielded nothing. Every drawer was neat, every shelf organized with meticulous precision. Beaumont, who had been roused from his bed, watched the proceedings with a look of calm, polite indignation. A respectable citizen being subjected to an unwarranted intrusion, he offered them coffee and answered their questions with a disarming placidity. The ledger was examined again, and Beaumont explained the large spice orders as bulk purchases for a new line of preserved meats he was developing. A plausible, if extravagant, business decision. The officers began to exchange weary glances, the entire operation starting to feel like a fool's errand prompted by the morbid fantasies of a priest. The immaculate facade of Auguste Beaumont was holding firm, a shield of normalcy that seemed impenetrable. It was in the cellar that the atmosphere began to shift. The air down here was different, cooler, damper, and carrying a faint but sharp chemical tang that pricked at the back of the throat. It was the smell of lye, a smell of industrial-strength cleaning that was at odds with the artisanal nature of the shop above. The cellar was as orderly as the rest of the premises, with barrels of salt and sacks of spices stacked neatly against the stone walls. But the obsessive cleanliness felt different here, less about hygiene and more about erasure. It felt like a space that was not just cleaned, but scoured, as if to strip away any lingering trace of its true purpose. Captain Renaud, running a gloved hand along the mortared joints of the flagstone floor, felt his initial skepticism give way to a primal, professional instinct that something was profoundly wrong. He paced the length of the cellar, the sound of his footsteps the only noise in the heavy silence. Then he stopped. He tapped his boot on one of the large, slate-gray flagstones near the back wall, under a row of empty iron hooks. The sound was wrong. While the other stones produced a solid, dull thud, this one returned a hollow, resonant echo, a subtle dissonance that broke the cellar's stony silence. He tapped it again, then knelt, pressing his ear to the cold surface. There was a void beneath. He looked up at his men, his expression now stripped of all doubt, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. He ordered them to bring the crowbars. Beaumont's polite smile finally faltered, his eyes for the first time showing not indignation, but a flicker of pure, animal panic. The mask was beginning to crack. The flagstone was heavy and sealed with fresh mortar, a clear sign of recent work. It took two officers several minutes of grunting effort to pry it loose from its bed. As the stone finally gave way with a sickening crack of breaking cement, a wave of cold, foul air rushed up from the darkness below, a stench so overwhelming that the men recoiled, choking and covering their mouths. It was a smell of unimaginable filth, a layered miasma of old blood, chemical residue, and the sweet, cloying odor of human decomposition, an aroma that had been trapped and concentrated in the unhallowed space. It was the true, secret scent of Beaumont's shop, a perfume of industrial-scale murder that had been hidden just beneath the floorboards, and its release was like the opening of a tomb. When they lowered a lantern into the opening, the light revealed a small, hidden chamber, a secret basement beneath the cellar. The scene was not one of chaotic violence, but of chilling, surgical efficiency. Heavy iron hooks, much larger than the ones used for meat, were bolted to the stone walls. In one corner stood a massive, industrial-grade meat grinder, its metal surfaces scoured clean but still bearing the faint, dark stains of its true function. A deep drain was cut into the center of the floor, leading directly to the sewer line Father Thomas had found. It was a factory designed for the complete and methodical disassembly of human beings, a place where life was systematically reduced to its component parts, a charnel house engineered with the cold precision of a modern abattoir. But it was the final discovery, in the far corner of the chamber, that shattered the hardened composure of even the most veteran officers. There, piled in a neat, almost reverent mound, was a small collection of children's belongings. There were worn-out shoes, a handful of faded hair ribbons, a child's cloth doll with one button eye missing, and a small, cheap tin soldier. On the very top of the pile, catching the lantern's glow, sat a small, exquisitely carved wooden mockingbird. It was Leo's talisman, the last piece of his identity, now resting atop a pathetic altar of the lost. This small pile of artifacts was the final, irrefutable proof, a silent, awking, heartbreaking testament to the true nature of Auguste Beaumont's select ingredients. The full, crushing weight of the horror finally descended upon the men in the room. The interrogation of Auguste Beaumont, as recorded in the official police transcript E, is a document of almost unprecedented psychological horror. He was not dragged to the precinct. He walked, his composure strangely restored once the discovery was made. He sat in the interrogation room not as a broken criminal, but as a lecturer preparing to address his students. There was no denial, no plea for mercy, no sign of remorse. Instead, he confessed to everything with a calm, detached pride, as if he were explaining the principles of his craft to an audience of less enlightened minds. He detailed his methods with the meticulous precision of an artisan, from the luring of the children with the promise of a hot meal to the final, methodical processing in his subterranean workshop. He articulated what he called his philosophy of civic alchemy, a worldview so warped it defied all human morality. He saw the street children not as human beings, but as a social blight, a form of human refuse that tarnished the beauty and purity of his beloved New Orleans. He believed he was performing a vital, if misunderstood, public service. "I was not a destroyer, Captain," he stated, his voice even and rational. "I was a recycler. I took the city's sorrow, its ugliness, its waste, and I transformed it. I elevated it into an object of desire, a delicacy to be savored by the very society that refused to see the filth at its feet. Is that not a form of art? Is it not a service?" His confession was not an admission of guilt. It was a manifesto of his monstrous ego. His final recorded statement, before he was led to his cell, encapsulates the unfathomable depths of his depravity. Captain Renaud, his voice hoarse with disbelief and revulsion, asked him a final question. Why? Why had he done it? Beaumont leaned forward slightly, a faint, almost pitying smile on his lips, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. "Because, Captain," he said, his words forever seared into the city's archives, "in a world that worships consumption, the greatest art is to make the unpalatable exquisite. I simply found the most abundant and most ignored raw material. I fed the rich with the poor. Tell me, in a city like this, is that truly a crime, or is it merely the logical conclusion of our civilization?" The city of New Orleans awoke the next morning to a truth so nauseating it threatened to unravel the very fabric of its society. The headlines screamed of the butcher of Chartres Street, the demon in the apron. The story spread like a plague, from the grand mansions of the Garden District to the humblest shacks by the river. The initial reaction was one of disbelief, a collective refusal to accept that the evil was not a spectral boogeyman, but a man they had welcomed into their businesses and their homes. But as the details emerged, the secret chamber, the pile of pathetic toys, the butcher's own chilling confession, disbelief curdled into a city-wide wave of revulsion and horror. The foundation of their civilized world had cracked, revealing the charnel house just beneath. The most profound and sickening horror was reserved for the city's elite, the very families who had prided themselves on their refined palates and discerning tastes. The matriarchs of Creole society, the wealthy merchants, the powerful politicians, all were forced to confront a hideous, indigestible truth. Auguste Beaumont's celebrated saucisse de spécialité, the centerpiece of their most elegant dinners, the status symbol they had so eagerly consumed, was a product of unimaginable atrocity. The secret ingredient they had so admired was the flesh of the city's forgotten children. This revelation was not just an indictment of one man's evil. It was a mirror held up to their own willful blindness, their own callous indifference to the poverty that festered just beyond their wrought iron gates. Every celebrated meal had been a quiet act of cannibalism, a sacrament to their own apathy. The trial of Auguste Beaumont was a spectacle of civic exorcism, a desperate attempt by New Orleans to purge itself of a poison it had unknowingly ingested for years. He sat in the defendant's box not with the posture of a penitent sinner, but with the unnerving calm of a master craftsman whose work was being unfairly criticized. Throughout the proceedings, he showed no remorse. His testimony delivered in the same measured, rational tone with which he had once described his finest cuts of meat. The city watched, transfixed in horror, as the full, methodical depravity of his enterprise was laid bare. His conviction was a foregone conclusion, and his public hanging in the courtyard of the parish prison was the most well-attended event of the decade. But as the trapdoor sprung, there was no sense of catharsis. Only the sickening realization that the monster they had executed was one they themselves had created, nurtured, and celebrated. His death did not cleanse the city. It merely confirmed the depth of its stain. For the elite of New Orleans, the revelations were a source of a profound and inescapable social malady. The horror was not simply that a monster had lived among them, but that they had been his willing, even eager, accomplices. Every dinner party where his saucisse de spécialité had been served was retroactively transformed into a scene of grotesque, unknowing cannibalism. A wave of collective nausea, both psychological and physical, swept through the grand parlors of the Garden District. Husbands looked at their wives, remembering their praise for the butcher's unique flavor, and felt a shared, unspeakable shame. For years, the very scent of Creole cooking, the rich blend of paprika, cayenne, and allspice, would trigger a visceral, sickening memory. The city's most celebrated culinary tradition had become inextricably linked to an act of ultimate depravity, tainting the very culture it was meant to define. The shop on Chartres Street, once a beacon of quality and respectability, became an instant pariah. Within days of Beaumont's arrest, it was seized by the city and boarded up, its windows covered with thick, rough-hewn planks of wood, as if to blind it from the world it had so horrifically deceived. No one would dare purchase the property, and it was said that even the rats gave its foul cellar a wide berth. The building became a wound on the face of the French Quarter, a physical manifestation of the city's guilt. It was a place children hurried past, a place where adults would avert their eyes, a silent, decaying monument to a horror that defied comprehension. The polished brass hooks, the immaculate white tiles carved in the great wooden block were left to gather dust in the darkness, a stage for a performance that would never again see the light of day. Father Thomas, the catalyst for this terrible revelation, found no peace in his victory. He was hailed as a hero, but the title felt like a crown of thorns. The faces of the lost children, especially Leo and his small wooden bird, were burned into his memory, a constant, silent accusation. He could no longer walk the streets of New Orleans without seeing the city's dual nature, the beautiful, sunlit facade, and the ravenous darkness that lurked just beneath. He had exposed the monster, but he could not erase the apathy that had allowed the monster to thrive. Less than a year after the trial, he requested a transfer. Unable to continue his ministry in a place so profoundly haunted, he left the city as quietly as he had arrived, taking with him the private logbook of names, the sole sacred scripture for a congregation of ghosts that only he could see. In the years that followed the trial, a strange phenomenon was reported by those who lived near the abandoned butcher shop. They claimed that on the most humid summer nights, when the air was thick and still, a faint spectral aroma would emanate from the alley behind the building. It was not the stench of decay one would expect from a derelict structure, but something far more unsettling. It was the rich, spicy scent of roasting meat, of paprika and allspice, mingled with a cloyingly sweet undertone that seemed to cling to the back of the throat. It was the ghost of Beaumont's craft, a sensory echo of his crimes that refused to dissipate. This phantom scent became part of the local lore, a chilling reminder that some evils impregnate a place so deeply that they become part of its very atmosphere, forever trapped between the worlds of memory and manifestation. Over the decades, as the eyewitnesses to the horror passed away, the sharp, documented facts of the Beaumont case began to soften, eroding under the slow, steady pressure of time and collective forgetting. The hideous truth of a society that had consumed its own children was too painful, too complex to retain. And so, the story began its inevitable transformation from history into legend. Auguste Beaumont, the meticulous, philosophical monster, was replaced by a simpler, more supernatural figure, the butcher of the Vieux Carré, a ghoulish boogeyman who stalked the night. The specific damning details, the ledger, the coded symbols, the complicity of the elite, were filed away in dusty archives, replaced by a more palatable narrative of a lone madman, a cautionary tale told to frighten children into behaving, ironically echoing the very legends that had once hidden his crimes. Today, the building that once housed Beaumont's fine meats still stands on Chartres Street, a dark and silent presence amidst the vibrant, noisy life of the modern French Quarter. Its brick facade is stained with age and neglect, and a thick carpet of ivy creeps up its walls, as if nature itself is trying to reclaim and bury the site of the atrocity. The ground floor windows remain boarded, the thick planks of wood now warped and gray with age. It is a dead spot in a neighborhood defined by life, a place that seems to absorb the light and sound around it. Tourists and revelers pass by it every day, most of them oblivious to the fact that they are walking past the epicenter of one of the most monstrous crimes in the city's history, a place where the American dream curdled into a uniquely American nightmare. On any given evening, you might see a tour guide pause before the building's decaying facade. A small crowd of tourists gathered around them, their faces illuminated by the glow of their phones. The guide will speak in hushed, theatrical tones of the ghost of the butcher, of strange noises and cold spots, of a vengeful spirit that still haunts the premises. They will tell a sensationalized and largely fictional story, a ghost story designed to entertain, not to inform. They speak of a supernatural evil because the truth is far more terrifying. The evil that dwelled here was not a phantom from another world. It was a man of flesh and blood, a respected member of the community, whose monstrosity was a product of the very human sins of pride, greed, and a profound, soul-crushing indifference to the suffering of others. The ultimate, chilling question of Auguste Beaumont's story is not whether he was a monster, but what kind of monster he truly was. Was he a deranged killer who created a sophisticated philosophy to justify his bloodlust? Or was he a cold, rational predator who saw a market inefficiency and exploited it with diabolical genius? His final confession suggests the latter, a mind so devoid of empathy that it could view the systematic murder of children as a form of civic improvement and artisanal craft. He was a creature born of his time and place, a man who looked at the rigid social hierarchy of his city and simply took it to its most literal, most horrifying conclusion. The greatest horror of the butcher of the Vieux Carré is that he was not an aberration. He was a mirror, reflecting the darkest, most unspoken truths of the society that praised him. The archives of history are filled with monsters hidden in plain sight, their stories buried under the weight of sanitized legends and comfortable lies. To ensure their shadows never fade and the tales of their victims are never silenced, subscribe and join us in our mission to preserve the chapters that time has tried to erase.